I've got a pretty heavy question for you, something that's been on my mind for a while. What if Dead Rising was released in 2005? How different would the game be today had this happen? What would Dead Rising be like if the release was pushed back nearly an entire year? Would the changes really have been that drastic? And the reason this is an interesting question is that almost happened. A while ago, I made a video documenting the entire history of Dead Rising, and in that video, I mentioned how the game was trying to be made as a launch title for the Xbox 360, which was November of 2005. And of course, we know that didn't happen, as it took roughly another 9 months before the game was finished. Dead Rising in November was a very different game compared to what we have now. The game that we got in August of 2006 is the product of those 9 months of changes. Their choice to push back the release date and continue working on Dead Rising is the sole reason why the game looks so different today. Many things were added into the game during these 9 months, but also lots of things were removed. Characters, weapons, vehicles, story missions, and entire environments were subject to change. It's the reason why the differences between the early alpha stages of the game and the final game is so shockingly apparent. Using early trailer footage and beta images of the game, and even by exploring entire beta versions of the game that we have access to, we have the ability to essentially go back in time and try to see what a 2005 Dead Rising would have been like. So, why don't we do that? To start things off, arguably the biggest difference we would have seen would be with the Willamette Parkview Mall. We say this because the mall is clearly the biggest thing on screen aside from Frank's forehead, so the changes that the mall went through make it very easy for us to notice, because back in 2005, while the mall was still called the Parkview Mall, and while many aspects were similar, the majority of the mall got a total redesign. This can be seen in whole plazas of the mall being remade or even being removed entirely. This means that the layout of the mall and the way the player would navigate it was completely different. Once 2006 rolled by, we were finally able to see the mall taking its more finalized shape, as all of the plazas from 2005 had been upgraded or replaced to the final layout we know today. And of course, most people are now well aware of Concourse, an early demo version of North Plaza, which was promptly replaced by the North Plaza we know today shortly after TGS 2005. Concourse is and was always going to be just a demo area. It's unlikely that Capcom had many plans to keep Concourse, as concept art for the final version of North Plaza was revealed not long after Tokyo Game Show. But it's completely possible that if Dead Rising released in 2005, the mall would have been early enough for them to keep Concourse in the game, which means that Entrance Plaza would have been extremely different too, as in TGS 2005, the back of Entrance Plaza actually led to Concourse, whereas today, it brings you to either Alfresca Plaza or Paradise Plaza. It's also very likely that Paradise Plaza simply wouldn't exist if the game came out in 2005. Paradise Plaza was shown off for the first time in February of 2006, and it was in a very rough, unplayable state. So it simply wouldn't have made it into the game if they pushed for a November release date. One of the strangest differences in the beta version of the mall is visible on the rooftop, as the entirety of the Entrance Plaza ceiling was missing. Entrance Plaza would have been situated in a completely different location, resulting in a very confusing layout if we were to play a 2005 version of Dead Rising today. Another aspect of the game that went through countless changes was with the weapons. And while most of them remained the same, many of the weapons from 2005 were actually removed from the game. During Tokyo Game Show, Yutaka Haruki was being interviewed about the TGS demo, and he mentions the name of many items that simply don't exist in the game today. Within the files of the Las Vegas 2006 beta, there remains the string names of a lot of the weapons that were removed since 2005. Dead Rising could have had a stroller, a remote control plane, a portable CD player, an electric razor, a handcart, a landmine, a grenade launcher, a rocket launcher, a plastic bottle, a knife sharpener, a usable welding torch, a card case, an oil drum, a crate, a microwave pizza, and, of course, the famous beam gun. Now, I don't have every name of every weapon that was removed since 2005, but you get the idea. The reason why a lot of weapons like these get removed is simply because they either don't have enough time to finish the item, or they aren't a useful weapon to use in the game, or they are a duplicate of another weapon with similar characteristics. This is the case with the beam gun being removed likely because it was too similar to the Mega Buster. Or the beam gun was going to be a Lost Planet weapon that they plan to add as an Easter egg in Dead Rising, but who knows. I have talked about this topic many times in my videos before, but the early beta zombies were extremely different. And I've even said that I think they were better than the zombies we got in the final game. However, for this video, I also want to talk about the issues with the beta zombies, because if the game released in 2005, this is the type of zombies the game would have had. The biggest difference between beta and final in regards to the zombies can be categorized into two main differences: the variation between each zombie and the textures. The variation differences being that in the beta, the zombies physically lacked much variation in their clothing, and as a result, when grouped together, they appeared as a giant wall of gray, red, and black colors. The beta was extremely muted because of this, as it lacked the more flashy, colorful zombie outfits that the final game would be given, such as the Willamette jacket or the construction helmet, and so on. This is partly the reason why the beta of Dead Rising is known for having a darker tone. However, the texture differences are also a big reason for this. For whatever reason, zombies in the beta were much more gruesome looking, as the textures for clothing had more blood and damage. This was noticeably reduced in the final game, as textures that were once soaked in blood are now just a bit dirty. The reason for this change is unknown, and I feel like it was a big mistake on Capcom's part. However, the final game of Dead Rising added much needed variation in the zombie clothing, making zombies appear more diverse, and you're less likely to run into 2 or 3 of the same zombie standing next to each other, which was a very common issue in the beta. So had the game released in 2005, these, for the most part, in November, are the zombies we would have had. It's possible that the change in zombie appearance for the final game might have saved the game, as reviewers might have scrutinized the game for its hilarious lack of zombie diversity. Dead Rising would have been regarded as a much more gruesome, visceral, frightening game solely because of these beta zombies, but it also would have made for a cheap, stale experience seeing the same zombie over and over. Capcom was able to find a good middle ground. Another major change inevitably happened to the many characters in the game. Sure, some of the changes aren't that drastic, but there are some changes that are just mind-blowing. The simple fact that Brock originally had hair in the beta is quite difficult to process. It goes without saying Frank West is one of the biggest character changes in the entire game. The artists originally tried to intentionally make him look ugly. This design was slowly phased out throughout development. Therefore, we got to see practically every iteration of Frank throughout the years. From his first horrible unveiling at E3, to his more refined appearance at TGS, to his more understood, realistic design at Las Vegas, and of course, the Frank we know today. But the changes don't stop at Frank, it extends into basically every character in the entire game. Of course, a lot of these changes were warranted, as the beta versions of most characters were intended to be later changed. A lot of survivors from 2005 and even early 2006 were essentially placeholders for what they would eventually become. However, there are quite a few characters that were changed for reasons totally unknown. One of the beta versions of Jessie had more pronounced makeup and a more realistic skin tone, and in the final game she ended up being extremely pale and almost doll-like. It's kind of creepy. And there are other weird changes, like Brad getting an orange shirt in the final game instead of the yellow one he had in the beta. Why? I don't know. Or Otis having his age in the final game being reduced by about 150 years from his last beta appearance. There's a lot of changes that went on during these 9 months, and of course, a lot of which was the result of cleaning up unfinished work. But the majority of these changes are pretty strange, and some are even a direct downgrade from their beta counterparts. So if Dead Rising was released in 2005, it's kind of a mixed bag for characters. Some were better, some were worse. I think critics would have been a lot more harsh in their reviews of Dead Rising, as some beta characters made the game look like an old PlayStation 2 game. I guess the final game isn't that much better, but you know what I mean. A lot of 2005 assets really dated the game's appearance. Textures look like they came from Half-Life or Counter-Strike. 2006 saw a huge improvement in many characters, and we can be thankful for that. And finally, we get to the most complicated part of this video, the story. The reason for this is everything we discussed before was visual changes, things that you could see from the trailers, but the story isn't that easy. We know that many changes were made in those 9 months, as some early aspects of the game's story made it into trailer footage, such as Jessie being killed in the maintenance tunnels, or Isabella being a more powerful antagonist, and also being held capture in the butcher shop. So there was clearly many changes made, but it's difficult to talk about, as unlike the beta zombies, which you can see in any picture of the beta, the story was intentionally kept secret. I can tell you that in the Las Vegas 2006 build, which is a late January demo, the story is pretty much all the same. So any build from 2006 then is not really useful to us, as its story isn't that different from the final game. However, that shift from TGS 2005 to Las Vegas 2006 seems to be major, even though it was just 5 months apart from each other. Frank was given a new model and a completely different voice actor. The entire mall was redesigned, and nearly everything in between. So it's safe to assume that in early to mid 2005, the story was quite different, and we luckily have some footage to back up these claims. So what do we take away from this? Well, yes, certainly if the game had released in late 2005, we would have seen some pretty drastic changes. But it's amazing to see that most of the story would be like we know it today. Yes, many in-game quests were different, characters would have looked different, and the path you would need to take throughout the mall to unravel the story would have been different. But the core of the game's story, the main cases, wouldn't really have changed. It would take a very early 2005 build for us to get an insanely different story. I can't tell you whether or not the beta story of Dead Rising would have been better because I don't have a build with a beta story in it, but one day we might unearth another pre-release version of Dead Rising, this time from 2005, that really shows us just how different everything would have been. And there we go. Sadly, our trip back to 2005 eventually comes to an end. Maybe this was eye-opening for you, and now you wish we got the original developer's beta vision of their game. Or maybe you dislike all the aspects of the beta now, and you're glad with what the final game became, and that's fine. What we got in the final game of Dead Rising was the result of countless hours of refinement. They wouldn't have done that for no reason. Dead Rising today might not have been as popular and might not have even gotten a sequel had it released in 2005. And sure, as a result of making this many changes, some cool features and aspects from the beta were lost. But at the end of the day, that's how game development works. You could try to develop something until you think you've reached a masterpiece, but if you never call it finished, you never have a game. Thanks for watching, and as always, subscribe for more.